I don't know if I ever thought critically about where scripture came from. Growing up in church, you kind of just accept the Bible. You don't think about, like, where did we get this book? I don't know if I just thought it came down from heaven. I don't know. I never thought critically about it. My dad introduced me to apologetics that helped me navigate this phase. However, I noticed there weren't any African Americans leading in apologetics. And so I wanted to do something to bridge the gap.
What's your hopes for the future of Christianity in the US specifically? Hello, welcome to today's show. Before Belle and I introduce today's special guest, we just wanted to let you know that this show is a listener and viewer supported one, and we'll be letting you know how you can help out towards the end of today's show. We'll also share some more of our thoughts on the guests from season 3.
And we'll also be sharing some of your thoughts on season 3. So do stick around at the end of today's show. But for now, here is our conversation with Lisa Fields. Welcome to another episode of Re-Enchanting, and not any old episode, the final episode of season 3, which is absolutely crazy. But we are the podcast from Seen and Unseen. I am Belle Tindall with my co-host Justin Brierley, and we ponder whether this disenchanted, materialistic world of ours can be re-enchanted with the wonder and the mystery of the Christian story once more.
And I'm really excited about the final guest joining us for this season of Re-Enchanting. Lisa Fields is the founder of the Jude 3 Project, an organisation helping the Christian community know what they believe and why they believe it, but with a strong emphasis in equipping those of African descent in the United States and elsewhere. Lisa founded the organisation after encountering significant intellectual challenges to her own faith, and today we'll be finding out what answers she discovered and some of the unique challenges that people of colour face when it comes to Christian faith, and how we can re-enchant the voice of Black Christians in the world of theology and apologetics.
Yeah, there's going to be so much gold in this conversation. I'm so excited. Lisa, though, before we get into any of that, we always ask the same question, and it's because we're usually in Lambeth Palace Library, and we'll get you there for part 2 of this conversation, I reckon. But for now, our first question is always, what are you reading right now?
Yeah, I'm reading an interesting book called Deliverance from Evil Spirits by Francis McNutt.
Wow.
That sounds
straight
full on.
in at the deep end. Come on.
So is that kind of, all about literal deliverance from evil spirits?
Yeah, understanding like how we understand evil in the scriptures and all of that stuff. So I'm only 3 chapters in, so
spiritual warfare and all of that kind of thing.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's exciting. Do you kind of have to read a lot in your line of work, Lisa?
Yeah. I mean, depending on the season, how much I have time to read, but I'm trying to constantly be reading something.
Tell us about your church background, Lisa. Where did you grow up? What was life like for you?
Yeah, I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida. I'm a pastor's kid, so I grew up in church. I always say that it's funny because I was born on a Sunday. So my dad was the minister of music at the church before he started his own church. He started his own church when I was in 4th grade. I always know because that's the year I went from private school to public school. So 4th grade is when the church started. And he was the minister of music when I was born. So he was actually on the organ when my mom went into labor. And so he had to rush. He had to leave church to go to the hospital for me to be born. So I was born on a Sunday morning.
Nice.
There you go. Very appropriate.
Yeah.
Very appropriate.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, church is kind of probably in your DNA then, really, from birth, literally, Lisa. So tell us what that was like. What was the kind of church that your dad was pastoring and so on?
Yeah, my dad pastors a Pentecostal church, and so majority Black, all Black congregation, Pentecostal background. So it was a very, I think, for me, it was normal. I had no frame of reference outside of it. It was a normal childhood. with my parents, my two brothers. And so we did everything normal kids would do, hang out with friends, except I always say elongated church stays. So like after church was over, because my parents were the leaders, we had to stay, I feel like, an hour and 2 hours after church. And that's the part I hated the most, because I just wanted to go when the benediction was over. So it's pretty normal childhood. Our parents made it normal as possible.
Well,
Yeah.
I now have kids who have to be dragged, to every church thing going because my wife's the minister of a church, and so they probably have the same feelings as you do. Oh, do we have to hang around for quite so long after the church service is actually finished, Dad?
Lisa, you find yourself in a really specific place right now with the Jude 3 project and everything you do around it. Can you tell us a little bit about the story of how the Jude 3 project came to be and how you came to be so passionate about what you do now?
Yeah. So I never wanted to be an apologist. I wanted to be a stockbroker working on Wall Street. We played the
Nice.
stock market game in the 5th grade.
Yeah.
And I thought it was a great way to make a lot of money. And I just never wanted to be in ministry, not because my parents were bad people, but it just was all consuming. And I mentioned staying after church hours and hours. And so I was like, I want to go, when I'm an adult, go to like a big mega church, sit in the back and leave as soon as it's over. Yeah. I don't want to be in ministry. And so I started at the University of North Florida, and I was an investment finance major, and I took an elective New Testament because I was listening to Christian hip hop, and there was a Christian hip hop artist named Flame who had a album called Rewind, and he had a song about hermeneutics. And I was like, oh, these terms are interesting. I'll take a New Testament class. Took New Testament at the University of North Florida. So nobody told me that New Testament at a university was different than Sunday school. So I thought it was going to be an easy A. It turned out our textbook was Bart Ehrman, Intro to New Testament, and that was a way different experience than my church experience. So I really struggled through that class. From that, my dad introduced me to apologetics. That helped me navigate the space. However, I noticed there weren't any African Americans leading in apologetics. And so I wanted to do something to bridge the gap. So I ended up switching my major from investment finance to communications with and religious studies. Would later go into banking after I graduated college because I needed a job to pay off my student loan debt. And worked at Bank of America and then Merrill Lynch for some time. Then felt the leading of the Lord to go to seminary. So I did what any thoughtful person would do, randomly quit my job, moved to another state, and went to seminary to start my MDiv program. And then the last year of the MDiv program, I started the Jude 3 project as really just some events that we did for pastors, local pastors in my hometown of Jacksonville on apologetics. And then that grew to a podcast, which grew to a historically Black college and university tour, which grew to a curriculum, which grew to a conference. These conversations we have online and now film. And so,
wow. Yeah. And it all started from kind of being challenged, I guess, in that New Testament class. I guess you were running into kind of, concerns, criticisms around the New Testament and its reliability that you just hadn't been exposed to before.
Correct.
So did that kind of really, for a while, floor your faith? What was the result of that at the time?
Yeah. So being introduced to Bart Ehrman was, I felt like, sent my faith spiraling because I didn't know if I could trust the scriptures. I didn't know if it was reliable. I don't know if I ever thought critically about where scripture came from. Growing up in church, you kind of just accept the Bible. You don't think about, like, where did we get this book? I don't know if I just thought it came down from heaven. I don't know. I never thought critically about it. And so thinking about the dating of the text, thinking about how can we trust what they wrote down? If time had elapsed, are they writing down accurate accounts? And then I think in class we played the telephone game where the professor told one person and then we went around the room, and by the time it got to the end of the room, it was completely different. And then you start wrestling in your own mind, like, if they wrote this years after it happened, is this an accurate account? Can we even trust that the people who wrote it? We started going through the Paul's letters. Are some of these actual Paul writings? Are some of these just attributed to Paul? And so all of those, and then we talked about the Gnostic Gospels, and all of that kind of sent me spiraling. And so apologetics and listening to apologetics were helpful because you hear other people like Dan Wallace who actually have different views. And so I think when I was sitting in that class, I was like, my teacher has a PhD in New Testament. I don't have a PhD in New Testament. My parents don't have a PhD in New Testament. Nobody I know has a PhD in New Testament. So who should I trust? The actual scholar or people who just have been Christians for a long time? And so what really helped me was to know that there were other scholars who had done the work on the same subject, like a Dan Wallace, who came out differently on the dates of the Gospels, and all of that. So that was really critical.
That was helpful. I mean, we do have someone with a PhD in New Testament with us, don't we, Belle?
Yeah, I did a doctorate in John in particular.
There you go.
So I fully, I mean, your professor sounds like no one ever made me do the telephone game. Like that just sounds like, I think that would break my soul into pieces. But when you talk about this whole idea of like human authors getting introduced to the composition of the Bible, and you start talking about dates and genre and memory and strategy and composition and all of these things, man, I relate. Yeah, it's not for the faint-hearted, maybe I would say.
Yeah, I guess maybe, like, I don't know whether you had a similar journey, Belle, of kind of having to rethink some of your sort of maybe Sunday school kind of teaching on the Bible and that kind of thing as you went along that.
Yeah, 100%. And Lisa, I don't know if you think this, but I really had to come to terms with this idea that I had in my mind where if humans were involved in the writing of the Bible, it wasn't a God thing. Because he wouldn't, like, if it's got human fingerprints on it, it can't have God's fingerprints on it. And that's what I had to reconcile. And then I had to make myself think, well, I don't think that about anything else in reality, anything else in life, that if humans are involved, God isn't. So why am I putting that on the Bible? And I kind of had to work my way sort of through that. But yeah, Lisa, I'm in awe of you.
Well, you kind of had to go on this journey, Lisa, obviously, and you were immensely helped by some of the scholars that you've mentioned already who helped you to kind of put that together. But what were you noticing, as you say, as you went along, that people who looked like you essentially weren't really represented in that discussion in the books? What was your experience at that point?
Yeah, so that's when I was like, we need to bridge the gap some kind of way to make sure everybody's represented and to highlight the scholars, because it wasn't that they weren't there. They just didn't get as much highlighting as others. And so it was a journey of digging to try to find the people that already had written on this that weren't given the platforms. And that's what we've been able to do with Jude 3, not only give myself a voice, but countless others a voice to share and give answers for the hope that we have.
What I was wondering, whether as you continue to kind of build this sort of, apologetics ministry that became the Jude 3 project, were you also encountering objections that weren't maybe specifically, or that were specifically centered around the concerns of people of color that were perhaps different to, if you like, general sort of concerns that you were encountering in apologetics kind of classes and literature and so on?
Yeah, I think the number one is Christianity, white man's religion, a lot around slavery in the Bible as it relates to how we think about that relationship to the transatlantic slave trade. And so those kind of, I think, were the two that needed the most attention. People feeling like I shouldn't actually buy into Christianity because it's my oppressor's religion. And so that was a major concern. It's still a major concern. I mean, we've done countless things on just that topic alone, and it is still the number one concern of many African-American millennials and Gen Z around why they don't want to be a part of the faith.
Yeah. Can I ask, I saw on YouTube, there's a whole like panel conversation that you've done on this, and I'm about halfway through, and it is the most insightful conversation. But just so I would recommend any listeners go and find this Christianity, a White Man's Religion by the Jude 3 Project. But just here and now, could you just break that open in that your answer to that would be no, I'm assuming. And can I just ask then, why would your answer be no, but also when and how did it become perceived as such, wrongfully perceived as such?
Yeah, I think the answer is no, because Christianity is Jesus died for all, not just Europeans. But then when we always go into kind of a 3-pronged approach in responding to this. Obviously, we talk about Jesus died for all, and that all are represented. So many nations are represented, even when the Holy Spirit in Acts is poured out. And so that's one thing. You look at the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts, but we also talk about church history. So early African church fathers, Tertullian, Athanasius, Augustine, people that were Christians that were African before the transatlantic slave trade. But then we moved to grappling with the text and slavery in the Bible, how slave owners misused the text of Paul and Peter's words for their own, to further oppress slaves. And so we talk about how Paul and Peter were thinking about that, and how in the scriptures in the Old Testament law, he says, like, you're not allowed to steal other people and enslave them. And so, like, God is not saying that he's pro-slavery. Now, there is places in the text where there's passages in slavery in the Old Testament where he's like putting restrictions because he knows the hardness of people's hearts, but it's not his desire for people to be enslaved. And then Paul says, if you could get free, get free. But they weren't in a democracy, so they didn't have the power to say, like, we're going to overthrow slavery. But they also thought that, and you're the New Testament scholar, so you could correct me if I'm wrong. They thought that Jesus was coming back in their time. And so they were trying to help people with their quality of life. When he says, slaves, obey your masters. If you have to be enslaved, do what's best for your quality of life in that situation. And so helping people kind of wrestle through that. I know sometimes those answers still aren't emotionally satisfying, but helping people wrestle through that has been one of the tools we use. And then we talk about contributions of Black churches. So that's kind of how we help people navigate that question in different ways, because I feel like different people need different things to that in response to that question. But why people think that is really because of the ways slaveholders used scripture to oppress people. And I think this started with Constantine, with when Christianity became the religion. And so all of those things, when people see that, they think it's the white man's religion. I hope that answered your question.
Do you get the sense that that kind of objection, particularly coming from within the African American community, has been kind of coming more and more, like in recent years? Have you seen a rise in the number of people kind of
especially
doing
with
that?
George Floyd, Christian nationalism, the rise of Trump? All of those things have made that, I think, a bigger concern for people.
I guess, obviously, you come from a vibrant, Black church tradition, and there's a sense in which I often think of the Black church as having given a place for people to have a sense of community, togetherness, in the midst of what were often very difficult and, oppressive circumstances. I mean, has that changed in recent generations, would you say? Is there less of a sense in which, a young Black person in the US today might kind of have a natural sense of, kinship with other Black Christians or churches than perhaps previous generations did, I guess?
I think, Black in the Black community, we're seeing a decline in participation in in even Black churches. Now, we still have a higher participation rate than majority culture, but we're seeing a decline as well. And so people often look for church for community, but also people are finding community in other places. And so while the Black church has historically been a place where people go for solace, I think younger people are finding other places for refuge.
I remember speaking with another young Black Christian apologist who you probably know quite well. The name's just completely gone out of my head as I'm talking. But you know the guy who runs True ID Apologetics, Adam. Yes, Adam. So he was saying when I last spoke to him that atheism per se has still among the sort of African American community still been somewhat taboo, not kind of very common in that sense. But he's even seen that kind of rising somewhat in recent years. I don't know whether you share that kind of perspective as well.
Yeah. Atheism is not something that many African Americans buy into, but it is on the rise. But that rise is still a slow rise.
Do you know, this might be a huge question, but I had no idea that was the case. Do you know why atheism wasn't really as much of a thing in Black communities?
Yeah, I think we just believed that there was a God. We might not have agreed on what God or, that there was only one God. But I think there's this just strong belief in a higher power. And so I think that's just something that communally we kind of believe in.
I mean, I guess then that it's not, because I guess a lot of apologetics does tend to get focused, doesn't it, on that whole question of, arguing for God, against atheism and so on. If that's not so much of a primary kind of area that perhaps is of relevance to the Black community, what are the specific kinds of different versions of God, I suppose, or different options on the table that you are kind of encountering and which you're trying to sort of, I guess, contrast to the Christian story?
I think how we flesh out, we see like Hebrew Israelism, which would be more of a Jewish cult. And when I say cult, I mean just it's not Jewish orthodoxy. So I would define it as an unorthodox version of Judaism.
So explain a bit more about it. It's called Hebrew Israelites, is that right?
Mm-hmm. So it's this idea that Black people are the chosen, are actual Jews, and from the tribe of Judah, and they came over on the transatlantic slave trade. That's the idea, that Black people are actually the Hebrews that are in the scripture.
And what's the, I suppose, what's the motivation for that? Where's that coming from, do you think? And I guess how like different is that from Christianity? It's obviously got some connection in terms of the claim on the Jewish side, but
there are different groups in it, so it's a spectrum. So some would say I identify as Hebrew just as a nationality. They don't necessarily have Jewish practice. So there could be a Hebrew Israelite Christian that says, I identify as Hebrew, but I still believe in Christianity. Some would say that Jesus is not the Messiah. They would take a more Jewish view on Jesus, that he's a prophet, but he's not the Messiah. And we need to carry out the law. It's a very works-based. So we won't live up under the curse. And so that's kind of the spectrum of it. But within that spectrum, I'm giving you kind of a broad, on both extremes, on both ends, there are people that mix the two inside. So some people reject the New Testament. Some people do Old Testament and Apocrypha. It's truly a spectrum.
When you speak about apologetics, and just for anyone listening who, because we have kind of listeners on the whole spectrum of Christianity, some who aren't Christians at all, so just apologetics, could you just break open that term for me and what exactly you mean when you say apologetics or an apologist? But then also, I would, it's not about, correct me if I'm wrong, Lisa, but it's not about never having questions and never having doubts, I'm assuming, because that would be kind of superhuman. So could you also just talk a little bit about doubts and questions as a tool, as something that, if engaged with properly, can galvanize as opposed to kind of like dissolve your faith and your hope and your reasons for having them?
Yeah, so apologetics, Greek word apologia, give from 1 Peter 3:15, give a defense for the hope that we have. I love the way Ergen Cantor describes it in his book, Encyclopedia of Popular Apologetics. He says that apologetics really is kind of I describe it as two wings, incarnational and informational. The incarnational is the embodiment of the message. The embodiment is a defense within itself. And informational is the information that you would articulate your beliefs, how you articulate, but you need both. So I'd say it's like two wings on a plane. If you get on a plane and the pilot says, do you want to fly with the left wing or the right one? You're like, I'm off of this plane. And so apologetics for me, for the gospel message to take flight, needs the embodiment of the information, because one of the biggest criticisms of people that are not Christians is Christians are hypocrites. So you have to have the embodiment. And then you have to have the information when people actually ask you the questions. And so that's how I see apologetics. It is to embody the message of the gospel and then be able to articulate the reason that we live it.
That's really helpful. And obviously you've been doing that sort of specifically, as we've mentioned, sort of bringing that kind of dynamic to the African-American community in particular. Is apologetics something that is kind of well established already in the African-American church, or would you say you're more of a pioneer in this area?
I think, we've always been able to give a defense for the hope that we have. We might not have just called it apologetics. And so I think I'm maybe more pioneering in bringing the language to it, but the work of apologetics has always been done. And so it's more giving people language for something that they may be already doing, or giving them the tools when some older people are just not aware of the things that maybe are interest to younger people, or don't know, like what Hebrew Israelites believe, or, what their kids are doing that are doing sage and crystals, stuff like that.
I mean, if you don't mind me kind of going back to some of those sort of interesting other sort of perspectives that you say some young people especially being drawn to. Another one that I have heard of, but you'll have to kind of, again, treat us as complete novices in this, Lisa, is kemetic spirituality. What is that? And yeah, just explain what it is and how you kind of respond to it.
Yeah, kemetic spirituality is really pointing back to Egyptology, because it's like Africans, people want to get back to what they feel like people practice, their ancestors practice. If slave masters came and brought us from Africa and stripped us of our identity, stripped us of our beliefs, let's get back to what our ancestors practiced. So it's getting back to Egyptology, or trying to find a faith that your ancestors, they feel like their ancestors believe, to try to reclaim identity. And so that's how I kind of approach it. It's like, I always look for what is the root issue that you're trying to solve for. I don't necessarily argue with them about what they've picked up, but I'm like, what are the issues you're trying to solve for? Okay, that's an identity issue. You're trying to reclaim your identity. And that's how I speak to it, because I found that's where I have the most success. So Hebrew, even when I'm engaging Hebrew Israelites, that's an identity issue. You're trying to find an identity that gives you value and worth, because slaveholders argued that you were 3/5 of a person by the Constitution. And so you need a faith that's going to give you an identity. And so I find the most success when I'm speaking to the root issue and not what people have picked up.
I don't know if it's the same in America, actually, but in the UK, certainly, like, just general, like, quite ambiguous and vague spirituality. So like crystals and meditation and all of these practices. And I think it can be really easy for Christians to be like, to go for the practice and kind of throw like a dart at it. But actually what you're saying is there's a craving within people. And actually that's usually a really good craving, a rightful craving, a craving that they were designed to have. And then I guess what we should do is exactly what you do, which is we go in and be like, oh, I have that craving too. And you give a reason for the hope that we have that in us gets satisfied in Jesus.
Yeah, that's what my I have a book coming out in August, and it's on kind of how to reach beyond the practices and reach to the cravings that people are hungering for and minister to that. That's where I found the most success in breaking through. Otherwise, you should spend a lot of time arguing with people about things. But if you listen to what the pain is, then you always have a better chance of penetrating and getting them to see the hope of the gospel. This verse was like highlighted to me when I was sitting in my class. And when I switched my major to religion, once I got exposed to apologists, I was able to debate with my professors a little bit more. I mean, they still had a PhD, but I had some confidence. And I remember arguing with one of my professors. And then in the middle of the argument, he said, well, why did God let my daughter be born with Down syndrome? And from that moment, I realized we weren't arguing about the logic that I thought we were arguing about. We were arguing about pain. And so I think sometimes we argue with people about things that aren't really their concern. It's really getting to the pain underneath.
That's really helpful. I wonder, in that sense, whether that's, I mean, it's probably true of lots of people's stories. And I often wonder whether there's a sort of a sense of disappointment, though, that goes with it, with people who maybe are rejecting the church and maybe picking up a different form of, spirituality. They perhaps have felt like the pain for them is that they feel like the church hasn't kind of, I don't know, represented them well. Perhaps they have felt like what I hear, what I see isn't who I am. It might be kind of more of a, white man's religion that they feel that they're kind of, that is being represented in that sense. So how do you kind of not only show people that perhaps, they need to rethink, whether it's the Kemetic spirituality or, Hebrew Israelite, but that church is good for them, that actually there is something positive here, that isn't necessarily just everything they've been told it is.
Yeah, I think one of the most helpful ways that I found is to be honest with them about our own doubts and struggles. That has been really helpful for a lot of folks. I see the things that they're wrestling with. I validate their experiences, that they may have had negative experience in the church. I've been in the church all my life. I've had some negative experiences as well. And I'm able to empathize and show them mercy. What I love about Jude, he says, have mercy on those who doubt. And when you think about Jude, scholars say he's the brother of Jesus. And when you think about John 7:5, it says that none of his brothers believed. And so maybe Jude can say, have mercy on those who doubt, because he understood what it meant to doubt himself. And I think when we're thinking about like navigating with people who are doubting, it is really leaning in to listen, to show them mercy, and to show them, like Jude, we have had moments of doubt ourselves. And I think that's one of the most helpful ways to minister in that space.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. That makes me think also about Thomas, whose nickname is literally his doubt, like Doubting Thomas. And I'm like, yeah, that was totally there, when he's like, I need to see the hands and I need to see Jesus' sign. I need to see all those things. And that's totally there. And Jesus is so gracious in that he goes to Thomas and he just puts his hands out. And what a beautiful way to meet doubt. But then also what we also forget about Thomas was that he's the first one, isn't he, who goes like, my Lord and my God. When he looks at Jesus, he's the first one to have that massive faith. So there was another side to his doubt but we didn't make that his nickname, did we? But that's so, so beautiful. Yeah. I've never thought about that from Jude. That's so nice.
I've got a question which is kind of at the more popular culture end of this, Lisa, which is that you kind of, part of your journey into apologetics was through listening, as you say, to hip hop music. And obviously there is a lot of great Christian hip hop music out there. Be interested firstly whether you think kind of that's how informed that is by this kind of awareness that of the kinds of issues you're talking about, the kind of apologetic issues that are specifically relevant, especially to African American believers. But how much the kind of popular culture, especially in the area of hip hop music, is kind of also, I don't know, telling a different story. Kind of it is maybe questioning, you know, is this all a kind of, you know, colonial, you know, patriarchal, whatever words you want to use, whether sort of that's sort of perhaps in a way that, you know, I guess the civil rights movement itself was a very Christian movement at its core. It was led by Christian leaders, whereas today I think some of the activists and the music perhaps that's central, it isn't necessarily kind of coming from that place any longer, and might be kind of itself leading people, you know, to different conclusions and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think hip hop plays a part, but I think hip hop gives voice to a culture that's disillusioned and frustrated, and want to see leaders do better. And it is like, this is the idea of Christianity, but it doesn't live up to the idea that I want to see. That's why the embodiment, I think, of apologetics is so important, because we spend so much time giving a defense with our words, but sometimes our life is far from that. And so I think people are frustrated with not the declarations of Christianity, but the lives of the people who are actually Christians. And so that cognitive dissonance is like, okay, this is what you say it does, but actually I have no proof of concept from your life. The first thing we do in culture today, I don't know how, I'm sure Amazon is popular in the UK, but when I go on Amazon and look at a product, the first thing I do is go read the reviews. And I think people are looking at the reviews of Christians and they're like, this isn't so great. I see the product advertised, but the reviews are horrible, so I'm not going to get the product. When the reviews don't match the product's demand, I automatically take that off of a possibility of the list on my shopping journey on Amazon. And I think it's the same way with Christianity. The reviews are bad. The product that's advertised looks good, but the reviews are horrible. And so people are like, I don't need that.
America is heading into quite the year politically. And you could say, one could argue that there's maybe a lot of that going on with Christianity. And this doesn't happen the same way in the UK. We're also going into an election year, and the chances are Christianity will not play a part in it, at least officially. In fact, if Christians, you know, even the most established and sort of institutionalized Christians, if they try to get into politics, there's a real get back in your place attitude. So this is very different, I think, in our two contexts. But in the American context, the chances are that we are about to see Christianity utilized and a little bit twisted and bent out of shape and all of these kinds of things. And there is such division that will come from that. So as an apologist, how on earth do you deal with the fact that some of the loudest Christians have a great byline and rubbish reviews? Like, how are you going to go into 2024 with all of this happening?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot. Just watching, I watch the news a lot, so thinking about that, seeing how people weaponize the faith. I really boldly say that, you know, sometimes what we're speaking when we're talking about Christianity is actually a counterfeit version. But a counterfeit version is only proof that authentic exists. You can't have a counterfeit without an authentic present. And so I like to highlight there is a counterfeit. And the enemy loves to use counterfeits. He's been doing that throughout humanity to deceive people. And so the presence of a counterfeit is also highlighting that there's the presence of the authentic. And so let's look at what the authentic Christianity is and how God speaks against how people are misusing Christianity. And that's one way. But also I try to live out my faith as the strongest apologetic message that I have. I love that in Jude, and I'm talking about Jude a lot because I've just done like 4 different messages on it the last week and a half. But when he says contend for the faith, he tells us what to do. He tells us why we should do it. But then when he gets to verse 20, he tells us how. And the first thing he says is building yourself up in your most holy faith. That he doesn't start with what you say, but how you live, like doing what you're supposed to do, keeping yourself in God's love. All of those are the first steps to contending for the faith, that you embody the message. Then he moves to have mercy on those who doubt. Then he moves to snatching them from the fire. So he goes from embodying it to having mercy to then pulling people from the fire. And we don't often think about apologetics that way, but I think that's the kind of apologetic method we need if we're going to have some traction in this culture today.
Yeah. I mean, I always think of you as embodying a really difficult place, actually, because you're obviously in an area. Apologetics tends to be sort of something that is very much practiced within evangelical churches in the USA, but it's also the place, evangelical churches in the USA, where the issue of race is perhaps the most divisive, and to that extent, it must be quite difficult for you to kind of be where you are, Lisa, speaking to hopefully a broad audience, but where obviously, people that you might see as your fellow apologists are also sort of maybe looking sideways at you and saying, well, do I, go with Lisa when it comes to issues around race and the church and so on? How do you navigate all that? Because I can imagine that is quite a complex one for you.
Yeah, I think what I've learned to do is just to do what God tells me to do. And who's ever on board is on board, and whoever's not is not. Because I'm thinking about, I could spend my time arguing with people who say, you're talking about race too much, and want to argue about critical race theory and all of this. For me, I'm like, I'm watching friends, I'm watching family, I'm watching the world, like in the fire. And my job is to pull those out of the fire. And that's where I focus my attention. I'm not going to argue when I know that there's a world that's in the fire and God has given me the power to help pull them out. And that's kind of how I deal with it.
Who are some of the folk who have kind of given you encouragement along the way? Because obviously over the years that you've been running this ministry, you've come alongside some wonderful people. Do you want to just tell us about some of the people that have really encouraged you and become, I guess, spiritual and intellectual mentors on this journey?
Yeah, I think there's several pastors. I think my parents, first and foremost, are my biggest encouragers. There are several pastors that have encouraged me throughout this journey. I think about Bishop Von McLaughlin. I think about Dr. Van Gaten. I think about Charlie Dates. I think about so many men and women, Dr. Cynthia James, who have invested and poured into me throughout the life of my ministry. And I think I get so much encouragement from the people that we've helped, I feel like, snatch from the fire. The students, the people that send us emails and messages. And so those are all people that have encouraged me and helped me keep going.
I am loving this so much. I'm literally writing down so much that you're saying, Lisa, just for my own personal, my own personal peace of mind. Could we do a little bit of apologetics? Seeing as I have you in front of me. We are, or when this is, we will be creeping steadily towards Easter. And so I feel like we would be remiss while we have you to not ask you about the resurrection, and to not ask you why you believe in it and why it is the hinge upon which your life, but also history, turns.
Yeah, so why I believe in the reservation.
Yeah, why not? Let's go straight in with the big guns.
I think, I don't have the same answer you might get from, what is the guy? He was a professor at Liberty.
Oh, Gary Habermas, are you thinking?
Yeah. My proof of the resurrection is actually the transforming work in my life. that is that I know that the resurrection exists because of the transformation work in my life, and that Jesus is alive. I could go and walk through, Gary's proofs for the resurrection, but for me, that all falls short if it hasn't transformed me. And I think sometimes when I'm in the midst of my suffering, my therapist told me this once. She was like, we focus so much on the suffering that we forget that there's actual resurrection. And so in the midst of my suffering, I look to the resurrection for the hope to keep going. And if the resurrection didn't happen, I have no hope for the continuing of the faith, which is what Paul says. If there is no resurrection, there's no hope to keep going. And so every time I see a Christian that keeps going, that is to me another layer of proof that he actually got up. And so that's how my response to the resurrection is. So I know it's not the most philosophical, proof-based answer, but
no. I think that's so profound, and particularly profound because of the things that you in particular steer down. You steer down like the bleakest, darkest parts of history, many of which have been done in the counterfeit, which I like, the counterfeit name of Christianity, and still there you're like, I see resurrection there, and that's where you see the proof of Jesus. I think that's incredibly powerful.
And one particular, I guess, apologetic one that I love when it comes to the resurrection is the fact that the New Testament writer documents that the first person to tell that Jesus was risen was a woman, and how women weren't in that day believed. And so it is actually a kind of proof of the resurrection that if women told the story, that the writers weren't actually lying, because if they were trying to lie, they would have said a man actually had the message. And so that's one, as being a woman in ministry, that I love, because it shows like God values women and God uses women in very unique ways, especially when you compare the resurrection account and Eve, and how the enemy used Eve to deceive man, but Jesus used Mary to redeem man by sharing the gospel through a woman. And so all of that, I think, encourages me when I think about the resurrection.
Oh, come on, Justin, do you want to give your apologetics answer to the resurrection?
I think, like you, Lisa, that the ultimate apologetic is absolutely transform lives, because you can do as much philosophy and history and rational argument as you like, but if the person telling you the argument doesn't look like a kind of example of resurrection themselves, it's never going to land, and that's the point, isn't it? I think people are only ever open to something if they've got evidence in front of them that it actually does what you claim it does in the end. And so it's exactly what you were saying at the beginning. It's incarnation and information. If you haven't got the both of them working in tandem, then your plane's going to fall out of the sky, basically. So I find that really a really helpful approach. Like you, I would say it's great to have the information, to do the Gary Habermas. But by the way, for those who don't know who Gary Habermas is, he's sort of one of the world's leading sort of resurrection scholars. Who I don't know, did you ever take classes from him, Lisa, when you were at Liberty University?
No, he did chapel
okay.
A couple of times when I was there, but I never took his class.
But basically, if you go to someone like Gary Habermas, he'll give you kind of, verse and chapter on all of the historical details that kind of you could use to kind of defend this idea that there was, that the genesis of the disciples' belief in the resurrection was absolutely a historical event. But I think even he, would say, but it doesn't make a difference in the end if the person you're telling this to doesn't see resurrection in your life. And that's what I love. I mean, just give us a sense of what Easter will be like for you, Lisa, this year, what it's like in your church. How do people celebrate the resurrection in your tradition?
Yeah, through a church service, communion, remembering the death, burial, resurrection through that way. It'll obviously, people dress up for Easter. If they don't dress up for any other time, they dress up for Easter, dress in Sunday's best. And then I live in DC now, so I probably won't be. I don't think I'll be going home for Easter. But if I was home, we would do a family dinner together with my immediate family and extended family. And so that's kind of how Easter is celebrated in my family.
Good. Well, I can tell you that it's not all that different from how it would be celebrated on our side of the pond as well. And it's. I mean, what's your feelings? Kind of. I guess we've talked about politics. We've talked about some of the journey you've had and the way that how you see the kind of situation, especially in the African American church. Lisa, what's your hopes for the future? I guess of Christianity in the US specifically. I guess I speak to a lot of people who see signs of hope, but also a lot of fears, a lot of kind of worries about the direction that things are going. Where do you stand? And if you do have hope, I guess I'd love to hear what you find hope in.
Yeah, I have a lot of hope because I know the darker it gets, the brighter we get to shine as believers. And so people are really hungry. I think, there's an openness to spirituality in this generation, whether it may not look like what we want it to look like. People are doing crystals and sage and all of those things. But when you peel back, people are really looking for the hope of the gospel, the peace that only the Prince of Peace could offer. And I feel like we have the right answer. And so I'm very hopeful that a revival will emerge amongst the next generation. And I'm looking forward to being a part of that revival and being able to embody it and proclaim and prepare other people to really pull people from the fire.
Because how, people, it's all very, like, the spirituality that people are going to is all very vague. But of course, Christianity, and in particular, people who are interested in the information and the incarnation of it, like how it's about getting those specifics nailed down.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
So is that where you you're like, this revival of spiritual openness is amazing, and then come to me and I'll be able to name it and put language to it?
So I would say, like, one example I always give is with crystals. So people who buy into crystals, what I've come to discover, many of them are looking for peace, right, at the end of the day. And so as I study crystals, I discovered that people use different crystals for different things. So there's a crystal in particular for peace. Then my friend told me one time that he had to charge his crystal on the hood of his car. And I was like, let me go research that. So what happens is you put a crystal in your room for peace. It's supposed to absorb the negative energy in your space and make it a more peaceful space. But what happens is when it absorbs the negative energy, the crystal is weakened. And so the crystal gets its power from the sun. So you have to go put it back in the sun to kind of power it up and you're like, man, you can believe in this, that this is happening. And so that's a cool opener to say, what if there was an actual sun that powered the sun that powered your crystal? To lead them to a greater power than the power that they're looking to. That there is an actual sun that's greater than the sun that charges your crystal, that actually is the Prince of Peace. And so you could use these things to lead people to the cross. It's just like Paul did with the unknown God.
Unknown God, yeah.
Well, that's exactly the passage that leapt to my mind, Acts 17, when you were saying that, Lisa, was where he says there to the Athenians, I see you are very religious in every way. He doesn't castigate them for their beliefs. He says, look, we're all looking for it. You're looking around, you're kind of grasping in the dark, but he's kind of acknowledging that they're on a search, just as you are for the person with the crystals. But saying, well, now I'm going to tell you about the thing you've really been looking for. I guess that's what you're trying to do as well. Yeah, I love it. It's great. Thank you so much for being our guest on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
And it's really exciting to hear about what you're doing. I love the hope that you embody as well, because it's easy sometimes to get disillusioned and a bit downcast, isn't it? About especially in an election year like we're about to enter into. So really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing some of your experience and wisdom. If people want to find out more about you and about Jude 3, where should they go?
Jude3project.org. And then my book comes out August 13th. Wherever books are sold. It's called When Faith Disappoints, The Gap Between What We Believe and What We Experience.
Oh, I can't wait for that book. I'm already so excited. We're going to have you back on in season whatever we're on then to talk about
That's a really good excuse to get you back, and maybe we'll do it in person at some point too.
Yeah, I would love that.
Yeah, that'd be great. Well, thank you again for being with us. All the very best as you continue your ministry, and thank you so much. Well, as promised, Belle and I are just popping up at the very end of this final episode of Season 3 to remind you that it's your help that really helps us to make Re-Enchanting happen. And Belle, do you mind if I just pat our own backs again a little bit and read out some of the reviews that we've been receiving for the podcast and video show?
No, it's becoming my favourite thing. Please do.
It's the bit where we get to massage our egos a little bit. No, this is from Adrian, who says, super conversations about stuff that makes life worth living. Wondrous. I look forward to every episode. Thank you very much, Adrian.
Thanks, Adrian.
And someone very much picking up on the title of the show, saying, we live in a disenchanted world. Materialism is the ruling presupposition in modern society. There have been quite a few shows that have challenged the secular worldview, but I think precious few that are attempting to re-establish a transcendent, enchanted worldview. And the latter is what Re-Enchanting is all about. It's not a defence, nor an attack. The show is more of an invitation to see the world through a new pair of lenses. I find the show incredibly refreshing. Look forward to seeing how it develops as a valuable voice in modern discussions about worldview, human flourishing in the future. I mean, that could have been written by some kind of PR person for the show, but it's just a regular listener.
I promise it wasn't. Neither me nor Justin wrote that one.
Not planted.
No.
Yeah, so it's lovely to say people were responding to the show. Again, we always love this kind of feedback, but nothing beats just telling people about the show, passing it on by word of mouth. But if you can leave us a rating and a review wherever you're listening or watching, that helps a great deal as well. And
so, Justin, we are at the end of season 3. Do you have a favourite episode or moment?
Oh, it's really tricky. They're also different, and it's very hard to choose between them. I did really enjoy, again, this is going back to early on in the season, Helen Lewis coming on, because it was really interesting to hear about the way that she thinks about faith as a non-believer. But just the way that she was so open and gracious and willing to talk about, the way she sees atheism, Christianity, and so on. So I love the fact that this is a show where we do get that diversity of different people at different points in their life and their views on faith. So really loved having Helen Lewis on.
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of on the flip side, because she was sort of outside of the church camp talking about feminism. And then we had Lauren Windle, who very much was inside, talking about her new book, but also her story of recovery. I've had so many comments from friends about that episode, and it was just a joy, I think, from beginning to end. So yeah,
definitely, wonderful. Two great shows. If you haven't listened to all of the episodes, do go back, make sure you've checked them all out. And and we do obviously appreciate people getting in touch, don't we? But also people who can support. I think you've got a brief word for us before we finish up, Belle.
Yeah, and I suppose the brief word would just be thank you, and just to remind you that Re-Enchanting is made possible by the generosity of our listeners. So just a thank you for making this season happen, and to encourage you that if you wanted to support us or subscribe or anything like that, seenandunseen.com is where to go. And we are very happy to have you on this Re-Enchanting journey with us.
Yeah, really looking forward to being back for season 4. We've already got some really exciting guests lining up for that. So do come back again. Have a very happy Easter, wherever you're listening or watching from. But join us on the other side of Easter as we begin our next season. I think towards the end of April, perhaps beginning of May. And we'll see you then.